Welcome back, everyone, to the second and final session this evening of the Green Talks Live Isle of Man Sustainability Debate. We are now going to take a deep dive and look at energy, power and sustainability, assessing the Isle of Man's progress towards sustainable goals and exploring viable options for renewable energy sources on the island. Is the island going to reach its goals for net zero by 2050? And if so, how? We're going to begin by playing you a video message from the Deputy Chief Minister, Jane Poole-Wilson, looking at the Isle of Man government's progress towards net zero and how it'll achieve that all-important goal.
Good evening, and thank you for inviting me to say a few words ahead of this evening's debate on sustainable energy. Just over a year ago, the Sustainability Centre hosted a one-day conference on building a low-carbon economy, which was timely and of great importance, not only because of the need to address the impact of climate change, but also because our future energy policy is crucial to our future economic growth and success. At that time, Tynwald had just approved interim targets of 35% reduction in emissions by 2030 and 45% reduction by 2035, as well as a climate change plan for the next 5 years. Within the climate change plan, we committed to developing an energy strategy that delivers 100% renewable electricity by 2030, along with a minimum of 20 megawatts of local renewables installed by 2026. In June 2023, we published the island's energy strategy, setting out a vision for the island's energy future as one in which our net zero ambition supports the economic strategy, taking advantage of the latest low-carbon technologies and optimising our own abundant natural resources, making us more independent and prosperous. The Isle of Man has a highly resilient but fossil fuel-dominated power system that needs to be decarbonised in order to meet our net zero targets and facilitate wider energy system emission reduction. We are currently almost entirely import dependent, a fact that leaves us exposed to international energy markets, the risks of which have become plain in recent times. Despite the strengths of our system in terms of resilience, the status quo has meant that we have been subject to global increases in gas prices, emissions that are very high on a per capita basis, and a scenario in which inward investment is threatened because business is unable to source the low-carbon power that it needs. However, there are a number of important areas that have seen substantial progress recently. In addition to the commitment to interim targets for emissions reductions, we have also set out our intention to deploy 30 megawatts of onshore renewables by 2026 and agreed policy to approve no further hydrocarbon exploration. There is much to be done, and the decarbonisation of our energy supply is critical, both to make the significant strides needed to reduce our overall emissions and to support our economy today and for the future. We have a unique and very exciting opportunity on the Isle of Man to shift to a low-carbon power system. In contrast to many other jurisdictions, we are faced not with a gradual transition over decades, but with the need for a somewhat wholesale replacement of power generation in the coming years, regardless of net zero. Our fossil fuel assets are coming towards the end of their life over the next decade or so, and therefore major investment is needed, irrespective of our decarbonisation agenda. We have to make changes, and we are going to make net zero changes. The approach to our energy transition is one where we must maintain agile policy, not simply relying on the evidence we have already collected, but remaining open to the potential benefits of emerging technologies. The debate tonight is a timely opportunity to hear from a range of panellists with their views on the current state of sustainability and renewable energy solutions. I welcome this ongoing conversation about our transition to a green and sustainable future and the options and opportunities for our island.
The Deputy Chief Minister there. Lawrie Hooper, she made the point, and a very important point, that the island currently relies on imported oil and gas for virtually all its energy needs, electricity, heating and transport. That makes this little island one of the highest emitters of CO2 per head of population in the world. That is bizarre and frankly unsustainable, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's why the government and the Timwell plan really is to get our energy network decarbonised. The problem we've got is we're moving from essentially a single power station to what would be a much more distributed grid, and that's a complex transition in the best of worlds. We've also got the advantage, I suppose, of having the interconnector with the United Kingdom, which allows us to import and export electricity. So there is an option for us to use our connection with the UK around balancing some of the grid. So baseload management is a terminology I've heard used, and it really should help us smooth out, I think, some of the fluctuations. From a party perspective, our approach has always been to remain technology agnostic. So we're not too bothered what type of renewables are used, because ultimately a mixture is probably what's going to be needed. But what we're concerned about really is a commitment to energy security, which is a slightly different thing to being more sustainable. Because in theory, we could become entirely sustainable by simply buying all of our green energy from the United Kingdom down that interconnector cable. That would present a risk to us as an island, because then if anything were to happen to that interconnector cable, we'd be quite badly exposed. So from a party perspective, we're quite keen to make sure we have enough local generation and local supply to make sure that we're not overexposed to that risk of needing to rely on somebody else for what is essentially a very critical part of our national infrastructure.
I mean, Andrew Langton from the Green Party, it doesn't matter really what the motive is behind it. It could well be energy security. It could be because you want to sort of, keep the biosphere. It could be for a whole host of other reasons. But the fundamental point is something's got to give, something's got to change. Is there enough political will? Has this issue risen above party politics here on the island?
Well, it's very clear why we're doing this, and now we've got legal commitments to put against the science that's been there for, we're going back to Rio in the early 90s, so we've had that information, now we've started to act, now we've got things in gear, now we've got the laws, now, well, we've had the technology, and we've certainly got it now to make the changes immediately, and we shouldn't be waiting around anymore. Now we need to reflect on the status quo and going, is our system in place the system that's going to bring about this transformational change, or is it the system that we've already got, which is only going to be the snail's pace that we've witnessed over the years, lots of talk, lots of rhetoric, zero action? And are we being serious when we've got all over the news at the moment, especially today, a talk about a fossil fuel company getting a license variation to explore for hydrocarbons? Are our leaders being serious? Does that reflect them taking this really seriously? And I think what we also need to look at is the Manx Utilities, the monopolistic generator and grid manager. Is that the system? That's the system that we've had, the Stone Age system. Is that the system that's going to transform into this new industrial revolution? I would say no, I don't think it's there. I think it's just business as usual, snail's pace. We're talking about a new interconnector. We're not talking about today. We're not talking about the solar panels today. Final point is Peel have proposed a 27 megawatt solar farm, 24 megawatt battery in Balawan, south of the island. Manx Utilities seem pretty agnostic, and that's the most charitable thing I can say about them towards it. They're going, that's a private company going, we'll build this now. We're talking about an interconnector in 2030, which is probably never going to materialise because it's not going to get to connect to the grid on time. Our politicians need to stand up, no variation to the licence, and take this seriously. Action today. Where are the solar panels on the hospital? Where are the solar panels on government buildings?
Dave, Quirk, is that fair? Government's not doing enough.
Well,
fine words, but not doing enough.
The Isle of Man is theoretically in a very good position. Nature dealt it a great hand when it comes to wind, mountains, shallow sea, ideal for offshore wind. We've got the perfect topography for energy storage facilities. But we do, I think Peter Bridgewater puts it, we do need the private sector to do the heavy lifting. So really, I would say that the governments should be facilitating this, making it welcoming industry and having the legislation and the commitment and the ways to get the funding, the upfront funding, and then again, like Andrew said, we need the infrastructure that will allow us to transition.
yes, there is the environment, yes, the topography, but is enough of that, of those sort of natural is there enough political will? That's what we're talking about here. I mean, you know, is there enough of an effort being put forward by those people in power to change things? And I'm talking specifically, obviously, about the government, but also about the monopoly that controls energy here.
Yeah, it's a complex thing, the energy transition, to be honest. But there's many experts around on the island who will be able to assist with that. And I think it's really saying the government needs to say we're open for business and really say this is what we want. And that's part of the strategy, which is being written at the moment, but there is a bit of urgency to it, yes.
Okay. Adam Creamore from KPMG. More businesses are coming under pressure, and we're sort of hearing this now, that perhaps it's the business sector that needs to do the heavy lifting. Because it's shareholders that are also putting pressure on as well, isn't it? And that is, the feet of businesses is being held to the fire when it comes to this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, businesses on the Isle of Man, whilst it might be a small office in the Isle of Man, might be part of a larger global group, or might be a big business within the Isle of Man by itself. They'll have shareholders, they have staff, they have lenders, all of which are starting to care more about environmental sustainability, social sustainability in everything that they do. That's a real challenge for businesses because historically they might not have measured that impact that they're having. They might not have those structures in place within the business to even consider those issues. That's a really big change for businesses to think about as time goes by. Access to renewable energy is just one topic on stakeholders' agendas. That represents a huge challenge, but also a huge opportunity for businesses. If they can assist their communities in becoming more sustainable, they have a great impact, and that makes them much more attractive to potential investors, to getting in the best staff, or even bringing in customers who are, have a little bit more nous when it comes to these things. So businesses who can come into the island and help with things like the energy transition or other sort of sustainability topics and the island's direction of travel in those areas, they can have a huge financial benefit over time just by showing they care about their communities.
Professor Curran, I want to go back to this idea that everything is there for the Isle of Man. It's got the topography, the weather, whatever. But there's something that's blocking this, certainly compared to other small island nations. Orkney, some of the Azores, Faroes, Canaries, much, much better, way ahead of the Isle of Man in the sustainability rankings and the prevalence of renewables over fossil fuels. Is the political setup in this country part of the problem?
My impression of the Isle of Man is you have a pretty good life here. So maybe that,
That's the trade-off, is it?
It engenders a sense of, let's keep what we've got. And,
right.
I can fully understand that. But, you mentioned all the resources that the Isle of Man has, which are huge. But it also has the resource of being a biosphere. And if biosphere means anything, it means embedding sustainable development, sustainability thinking right at the heart of everything you do within that kind of ecological setting. So, that must drive the way everyone on this island thinks. It's about the community, isn't it? And the writing is absolutely on the wall for fossil fuels. The EU is now going into COP28 next week with a statement that fossil fuels must be phased out, not down, out. And they've said there should be no more investment in new fossil fuel extraction. And that coal has to go by 2030, gas by 2035, oil by 2040. That's a pretty powerful statement coming from the whole of Europe. So the writing is plainly on the wall. So from the great and rather privileged position you have here on the Isle of Man, the urgency is now immense. It's a climate emergency. That means it's urgent and it needs to move right now and fast.
John, I'll bring you in a second. John Galloway, you build wind farms for Ørsted, right?
Yep.
Are you bemused by the fact that this place hasn't got one?
I don't think I'm bemused about
Shocked?
it, Clive, and I'm not shocked because we're working on the first one. So,
but it's 2023.
It is 2023. I think the reality when it comes to creating the correct atmosphere for investment, for offshore wind farm development, it requires a number of different factors. So the original agreement we were granted for the first offshore wind farm, we got that agreement in 2015 from the Isle of Man government. In the global sense, that was pretty much pushing ahead of the curve. It was pushing against some other countries in Europe about the first leasing rounds for offshore wind. The thing that has changed and what's invited further progress on this development that we're bringing forward is setting the political tone. So the Climate Change Act, the Climate Change Action Plan, the new energy strategy, all happening in the last couple of years, sends the signal that there is going to be some certainty, particularly in the policy context, that supports bringing forward those developments. When you think of developing an offshore wind farm, these are large-scale capital projects, and what they need is a 7-10 year lead-in to get to the operational stage, and in political sense, those cycles are often much shorter. So if I think of the UK as a success in offshore wind farm development and deployment, it's a world leader in what's in UK waters, that all came about from picking a route to supporting that at a political level way back in 2007, 2008, and having some of those major leasing rounds in 2009, 2010 awards were made. Those projects awarded in 2010, some of those still won't be operational till 2029. That's the lead-in time that these things take. But over that period of time, what you've got to look for is the support, political will, yes, but a bit of consistency when it comes to the regulatory framework and the policy context.
Right, so that consistency hasn't been there, Andrew Langan.
Well, I was going to raise the point about the last question, sorry,
Yeah.
which was about your really profound point about the governance system in the Isle of Man. Is that why we're failing? And I think when you've got a system where over 80% of the politicians are members of the government department, where is the accountability? Where is the scrutiny then? You've got members of the government who are not ministers, stuck in departmental positions, not applying that proper scrutiny, and we've got the tail wagging the dog. Illustration, we've got this confusing situation, paradox maybe, where Ramsey, which is the place in the island which was most at risk of overtopping, of flooding, on all the UN scenarios for the Isle of Man, where you can see the waters rising. Ramsey is that hotbed for the risk, and you've got a large conurbation which is immediately at risk of that overtopping, of that flooding, and you've got the two political members for that constituency, ministers, propping up a government which is talking about varying a licence for a fossil fuel company that's going straight into drilling without going through the proper mechanisms for safety and control. It's a paradox.
Lawrie Hooper.
If I can, Ramsey is my neck of the woods. Andrew might not be aware, but I actually voted against the extension of the drilling licence in Tynwald. I have a very clear pre-stated position on that, which actually is respected by our system. It is slightly different to a UK system where you are sort of toe the line or else. It is a slightly more nuanced position here. But I think picking up John's point about that consistency, because we do have a lack of embedded party politics on the island, nearly every decision is a compromise. So there are 9 ministers around the table. That's like a coalition of 9 different parties. So everything we do is a compromise. We then go and compromise with Tynwald members, because there's 33 members of Tynwald, each of them is their own individual party. So it gets complicated. So inevitably it means that it takes us longer to reach a decision, I think, than it may do in a comparable jurisdiction. But the advantage of our system is when we do make a decision, it's very hard then for us to change course.
Change it, yeah.
So now that we have decided, we've passed the Climate Act, we've got our net zero policy, we have our energy strategy, the reality is shifting away from that actually is going to be quite difficult, which gives you some of that longer term certainty that maybe you wouldn't get in a more party political jurisdiction where you might be subject to bigger swings at sort of an election. So unless something goes radically wrong at the next election, it's quite likely that some of these government policies that were approved in the last administration will carry forward. So decisions around things like offshore wind or whatever it may be, actually you should get a relatively stable environment, which should then help attract some of that external inward investment that we're all talking about. So on balance, I think the Isle of Man has a lot going for it. I think where I would be critical of the island is that we have been quite late coming to the party with some of this stuff. So whilst I think the island was slightly ahead of the curve with the granting of some of these licences, my question would be, well, why haven't we granted more than one? Surely there are more companies than just Ørsted out there interested in developing offshore wind. And they're the kind of...
Well, why?
They're the kind of questions that I think we haven't really been able to get underneath until we've managed to develop some of that strategy, some of the policy work that has taken a long time to come to fruition. But now that I think we're there with the strategy and the policy, it's quite likely that you will start seeing an acceleration, I think, of some of this stuff. And so from my perspective, really, as a party leader, our position on some of this stuff has been quite consistent, I think, over the years, that we have felt government needed to move quicker than it has done. And I think in a more party political environment, we would have moved quicker. But now we've got to where we are, I think you are going to start seeing things steamroll a little bit. I mean, Ørsted is a really good example of this. 2015 to 2023, not a lot of development, not a lot of progress, but actually in the last 12 months, they've really come leaps and bounds. And that's the kind of a really good analogy, really, for where I think the island's energy sector is more broadly. It's taken us ages to get here, but I think you will start to see things happen now a lot quicker over the next few years.
Okay, Professor Curran.
Yeah, I enjoyed that political analysis, but I wondered if I might be able to counter it, at least to some degree, because by definition, at the heart of a biosphere is that concept of sustainability, and governance and government therefore must fully adopt the elements of true sustainability. And if sustainability means anything, it means about breaking down those divisions, breaking down those boundaries between traditional thinking, traditional professions, traditional disciplines, and being highly creative in those unvisited spaces between those boundaries. And I would have thought if sustainability is at the heart of government and governance, then those difficulties should melt away.
I'd agree with that to some extent, actually. I mean, as a party, we are a biosphere partner, actually. I think we are the only political party that is a biosphere partner on the island, which I always find quite amazing, given that we all talk about sustainability quite a lot, actually. The problem I think you've got is, as a government, we might be very committed to sustainability, but that commitment doesn't necessarily extend then into the rest of Tynwald. And that's where you start getting some of that confusion. So a really good example is the current project to develop onshore wind on the Isle of Man. So the MUA is saying they've located some sites, but actually the most stringent opposition is coming from members in those constituencies. But I think if you ask them the question, are you committed to sustainability, to onshore renewables, the answer would be a fervent yes. But not in my neck of the woods. And that's kind of the problem that you have with our system, is that as a government, you could be 100% behind it, but then when you're extending that into tackling Tynwald as a whole, government on the Isle of Man is always a minority government. Like I say, there are 9 in Council of Ministers, that's the government, broadly speaking. So we are always in a minority, and so you're always trying to bring everybody else with you, and that's when you run into some of those barriers. I can influence the way government works and government thinks in those spaces. I can't bring backbenchers necessarily along with me in that journey. So you always end up, again, with a compromise. And whenever you have a compromise, it slows things down. It's never going to please everybody. And the reality is you do end up with that slower progress that I've talked about. So I would accept everything you're saying, but I think we only control what we can control, ultimately, and the rest of it is somewhat up to fate.
Right. Adam Creamore, you wanted to come in there?
Yeah, I think we've talked a lot about sort of, political will and those kind of driving forces, but ultimately, you'd like to think in the Isle of Man, political will is driven by the constituents that those political representatives represent. Ultimately, if the people of the Isle of Man, the community groups of the Isle of Man and businesses in the Isle of Man can engage with their local MHKs or government more widely and express that will of the people, ultimately, if people are committed to renewable energy, preventing climate change, changing the way the Isle of Man does things in some cases, that voice will be heard because we have a relatively accessible government compared to, say, the UK. I mean, our MHKs, on a per head representative basis, it's really easy for me to speak to my MHK or express my opinion. So if people express those opinions, engage with government, that political will be created, whether, we can talk about whether it exists at the moment or not, and people will have differing views, but it can be created if it doesn't.
Okay, let's open it up a little bit now. Let's get some questions. There's a lady here at the front.
So talking about getting the public on board with action on energy on the Isle of Man, what is the capacity for community-owned energy generation on the Isle of Man?
Well, Section 12 of the Electricity Act might be a prohibition, prohibit that. MUA, I think, it's not unclear because that provides the monopoly, the Electricity Act provides the monopoly to Manx Utilities to sell electricity. So that's something that needs to be looked at. And also that could be used to liberate our energy system. As an illustration, Octopus Energy in the UK, if you live in a region of their wind farm and you can see the wind turbine turning, they'll give you 50% off the electricity bill. After they said that, Greg Jackson, the CEO of Octopus Energy, he said he got thousands of requests from people going, come and build a wind turbine in my community. I want 50% off my electricity bill. Is Manx Utilities got that kind of creative thinking? Or is the problem Manx Utilities and liberalising that? And certainly we passed the Climate Change Act, and in the schedules of the Climate Change Act, that section under the Electricity Act can change. That's in the hands of, I think it's the Minister of the Department for Enterprise. He can change that. And we need to know whether our politicians have the vision to go, we need a different model. We don't need the Stone Age model. We need the new industrial revolution for clean energy in the Isle of Man. And so certainly, are we going to see energy schemes like community energy schemes at the moment? Clearly not, because there's a huge ambiguity about that section under the Electricity Act.
I'd take a slightly different view on it, actually. We've spent the first hour of this debate hearing how a single private company is managing to do their own thing. That's quite commonplace. There's a few on the island that are doing that. I don't see, in my mind, a community generation scheme being any different. So the challenge, I think, is when people want to export energy onto the grid. That's when we normally get challenged. But I think if people are talking about something that is locally owned, locally generated for your own use, I don't see that as being a particular barrier, actually. And to my mind, there's a lot of conversation around public versus private ownership around critical infrastructure. And I think the evidence is out there that, by and large, public ownership tends to be cheaper for the end consumer. And that, I think, is a really important thing to bear in mind, is that whatever you're talking about, ultimately someone has to pay the energy bill at the end of this. And so whatever we're looking to do, I don't think it should be driven ideologically. It should be about what's best for the consumer, what's best for the people on the island. What's best for the people on the island is cheap, readily accessible, renewable energy. So the question is, what's the best way of delivering that? And like I said, my party's view is we're completely agnostic about it. I do not care how locally generated energy is generated. Provided it's renewable, provided it's cheap, crack on. Solar panels on your roof, wind farms, people are talking about geothermal energy or hydro, whatever type of model it is, I'm very happy with all of those. The ultimate end goal needs to be, is it affordable for local people? And some of that might be locally owned energy. It could be community heating schemes that are using industry to generate some of their heat or some of their electricity. It could be the MUA providing it directly. It could be privately owned. I don't think it matters, ultimately. My understanding of the way the energy framework is that the legislation, like Andrew says, can be changed quite easily to accommodate any of these things that may come forward. So I don't think the legislation is in and of itself a barrier. I think the barrier is our ambition. Do we want these things on the island? Do we have someone saying, I've got an energy scheme, a locally owned renewable scheme? Brilliant. I'm not aware of any that are coming forward, and that's, I think, where the gap is. How do you entice people and encourage people to say, I'd like to try this, please? And that's where I think the conversation needs to move to now, rather than worrying about, what does the law say? Okay, we can change the law. That's my job. I mean, that's basically the only thing I spend my life doing, is changing the law. Mm-hmm. But the reality is, if someone doesn't come to me and say, I've got a scheme that's being stopped by the law, why would I even think about changing it?
Okay, you say it's okay, crack on, doesn't matter how it's sort of produced, the energy or whatever. So I'm going to put this question to you, Dave Quirk, and this is from a member of the public. Why have I not seen any government reference to tidal or nuclear as a means of power supply when we live on an island with limited requirements for electricity? Even a number of different supplies to complement each other. A mix. Why is there no sense of an energy mix here?
Yeah, well, can I just come back one step? First of all, why we're doing this is for two reasons. One, you can solve more than 3/4 of our emissions if our power is renewable, so that's heating, electricity, and transport. And it's cost effective, it's cheaper. The reason that other islands are doing this is because it just saves money. You're not buying fuel, and fossil fuel, of course, has its additional penalty, which we'll ultimately be taxed on. When it comes to some of the alternatives, some of them are expensive because they weren't invested in early on. There was a lot of investment in wind in Denmark, for instance. So that technology is quite far forward. Tidal comes in about 5 times the cost of wind.
Right.
Nuclear, the issue there is it's not a modern industry in that respect, and it's going to take a long time before, and radioactive waste has actually still not been solved, and decommissioning it is now the problem with. So there are new ideas, and it may not be uranium, but nonetheless it's a long time in the future, and at the moment, if you're going to choose the most expensive, when you take decommissioning and radioactive waste into account, it's the most expensive.
Okay, I think that answers this other question, because it's interesting that this has come up. This is from another member of the public, Susan Woolard. Aren't wind and solar expensive? Please would you state all the different renewable power sources and the pros and cons of each for the Isle of Man? I think you've just
and we've put it on the website
that
as well, so it's
okay. So that is there for people to have a look at. Okay, let's get another question from the public. There's a gentleman over here.
We've heard about big projects and the government's commitment to renewables, which is great to hear, and I'm sure we're moving in the right direction. 90% of businesses on the Isle of Man are small businesses. They've been through COVID, the cost of living crisis, the energy, increased in costs over the last couple of years, and now high interest rates. So they've been through a hell of a time, and it's difficult for them to find the funds maybe to invest in efficiency or renewables. What should the government be doing more for them to help them invest and bridge that gap?
Adam?
I think when we talk about sustainability, sustainable energy, whatever it might be, sustainability is more than just green. It has to be sustainable in the long term. So if you're a business, chucking millions of pounds at a problem as a small business is clearly not viable. It's clearly not sustainable. But looking at small steps that you can take proportionate to what you're doing as a business is really key. Sustainability can be profit making, not profit losing. Reducing your electricity bills will save you money in the long run. So, looking at it from a what can we do that are quick wins perspective is a great place to start. Looking at it from a perspective of what's a reasonable level of investment for us and what's the payback period. We talked earlier about Zurich's efforts with their solar panels. It's a 7-year payback period. For most business decisions, an investment that pays itself back within 7 years is a pretty reasonable investment case. So if you look at it from that kind of perspective as a small business, you can still have those benefits over a long period of time, recognizing, of course, that it has been a challenging few years for businesses, certainly in particular industries as well. You have to take that truly sustainable view. You don't want to put yourself out of business trying to cut your carbon footprint by 5%. That's clearly not, good for the business in the long run. But recognizing that to survive over, say, a 10-year or 20-year horizon, a little bit of environmental improvement might go a long way to helping that business become a bit more profitable in the long run as well.
Okay, Professor Curran?
Yeah, there are so many answers, swirling through my mind to that brilliant question. I'm an ex-environmental regulator, and so I remember from many, many years ago that if we would go into companies and we would regulate, so we were regulating them against very specific environmental standards on emissions or discharges, but we would very often suggest to that business that they could do an awful lot of other good things if they just did a bit of internal environmental audit. And time again, evidence would come back that doing pretty simple analysis of your waste, and there are various elements to waste, if you did something about them, nothing very clever, your bottom line would improve by 10%. And that closes half the gap between our productivity and European productivity, so something worth grasping. So that's looking at how much energy you use, how much water you use, how much waste you generate, can you reduce your input of materials and so on. I don't know what business you have, but that is pretty basic stuff. You don't need to be very sophisticated. But another thing that occurs to me is that obviously I was a regulator in Scotland, and we had a big challenge from the Scotch whisky industry, which was not a good environmental performer. And we had numerous confrontations with them. Their trade association, and you may have a trade association, you may not, but the point is their trade association declared a non-competitive zone on environmental improvement. So all the whisky distilling and whisky bottling and whisky exporting companies in Scotland got together jointly to improve their environmental standards. And they are now genuinely one of the best environmental performers. They are still ruthless in their competition when it comes to marketing. Of course they are. But they got together as a group of businesses to help each other become more environmentally performing and more sustainable. And I'm a great believer in the circular economy as the economy that will address so many of our sustainability problems. And I would just hope that businesses can get together and say, let's help each other. Even if we are competitors, let's help each other get better in terms of environment, sustainability and circularity.
Andrew Lang?
We need new business models and we need financing. We need to look at private enterprise like Clara Isaac in the last panel, amazing, Recycle Collect. They are like the Uber of the Isle of Man. They're a new business coming in. Their customers, the people, I can't recycle, my local authority doesn't do recycling. Click on their website, automated, then they come in, drop off the boxes, then you put in your recycling, they're coming to collect. We need business models like that, like solar panels, rent a roof. Your business, it's got a roof, it's just sitting there. Get a solar panel on there, get a business to come in, pay for the solar panel on there, maybe you get a bit of the electricity, and then they sell the rest back. And again, with heat pumps, we know heat pumps are a solution. They're 4 times more efficient than gas boilers. You put 1 unit of electricity in, you get 3 units of heat, 4 units of heat out. There, we have the technology. What we're missing is the business models and the financing. And again, the question is Manx Utilities the entity there that has the creative thinking that solves this for the Isle of Man? Or is the businesses out there like Recycle Collect that's going to offer that solution?
Larry Cooper, you wanted to come in there.
I was just going to throw this back to Steve a little bit, actually, because I spent 5 years in the Department for Enterprise in the last administration. And I can speak from experience, say a lot of the support schemes they have there are actually pretty good in terms of supporting local businesses. I know the business agency does a lot of work supporting local industry. And I was talking to Ralph Peake at the start of this, and actually I know one of the things Ralph's quite keen on is essentially saying how do you maximise the output from the private sector? So how do you bring private sector people together, ultimately? Because government doesn't have all the answers. So I'm going to disagree with Andrew a bit on that. I don't think the MUA has all the answers, and I don't think it's their job to provide them. Actually, I think really it's government's job in some cases to say, if you've got these small businesses that are, family firms quite often, they don't have access to the kind of resources the government has access to. Can they afford to pay KPMG to come in and give them advice? Arguably not. I've seen what you guys charge. But that's where government, I think, can help. The DFE can step in and say, well, how do we put KPMG in a room with some of these small family businesses and make sure they're getting the right advice, the kind of environmental audits that Professor Curran's talking about, to say, how can you make those small changes to your business that will really help your bottom line? And that's where I think government does have a role to play in stepping in a bit more, possibly, and supporting some of those local businesses, but not necessarily by directly supporting them, because, like I say, government doesn't have all the answers, but quite often it's about making sure those local businesses can access that kind of expert specialist support from professionals who can go and provide them with the right advice to say, well, how can we help you make your business better? It's not about government telling you what to do, it's about facilitating, I think, sometimes.
Andrew's shaking his head vigorously there. John, you wanted to come in on that one.
I think more just to, it's not my role to leap to the defence of Manx Utilities at this debate. The only point of reference I might just make is, of course, the entire debate around sustainability in the Isle of Man is all about the transition. This is a change in a very significant direction over a pretty short frame of time, given all of the challenges that there are in terms of replacing the fossil fuel generation and all the other things. And we can already see in the UK, when it comes to this transition to huge amounts of renewables coming onto the grid, that National Grid is facing a huge challenge in the UK, and the UK government is facing that challenge right now in terms of deploying what's needed from an infrastructure point of view. Now, Manx Utilities' role in that sense is at a much smaller scale, of course, but then the grid infrastructure and the backbone of that grid here in the island is also at that smaller scale and will need a huge amount of investment and change in order to transition to that. So, the targets are really ambitious, around 100% renewable generation by 2030. That leapfrogs targets in many other countries. But that actually is going to need quite a lot of focus, drive and investment in a way that's not been seen for a generation, maybe a couple of generations, in terms of the Isle of Man's focus. So I think there is a lot more that everyone can do. That's the whole point of the debate. But we have to keep in mind the challenges that we set for someone like Manx Utilities, that they've got to deliver them to match the political will and momentum that we've been talking about earlier.
Sure. I just want to bring Adrian in here because there seems to be a lot of focus on wind. And I'm just, is there any downside? Does the wind ever maybe, I don't know, stop for a week or blow too hard or not enough? I mean, is there too much emphasis on perhaps that aspect of a renewable or a sustainable energy source that maybe it's too much of a single? Is it really a silver bullet?
I think being a little wonderful lump of rock in the middle of the Irish Sea is our greatest asset in many senses, and one of those great resources that we have reliably is wind.
Reliably?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, okay.
Being a small landmass surrounded by sea, the wind speed over the oceans in general, but over the sea in particular, is more reliable, it's more sustained at an average speed and less turbulence. You get less gusts than what you do over inland mountainous areas, for instance. So the average wind speed on the Isle of Man over the land lends itself very well at 15 miles an hour.
You're right.
When you average it over the whole year. Of course, we do have our autumn gales and we do have an occasional winter storm, but so do other parts of the existing infrastructure in the UK and in the North Sea. And wind power being a mature renewable, that has been engineered into those structures already. They have management systems that can cope with an occasional storm Debbie or whatever.
Right.
And you manage those rough patches, which are few and far between. And quite amazingly, in the Irish Sea, the calm patches, if you've not heard already, are rare. More often we're worried about having too much wind, yes.
Right.
But the average wind speed of 15 to maybe 20 miles an hour over the high ground and 20 to 25 miles an hour in our inshore waters, that's very reliable. It's very steady and you can count on it. And perhaps you can generate a surplus of energy and come up with the additional thing that the Isle of Man has, the resource to store some of that energy. And the cheapest and most reliable and long-lived energy store that we can do is store some of that energy using hydro pumping. You pump some of that surplus energy, use that energy to pump water into a holding reservoir up in our hills. And then when you do get that calm patch, you can release that water to produce hydropower for that period that you need it. So we have all those natural advantages being this lump of rock in the Irish Sea.
Which makes it even more bizarre that you still haven't built a bloody wind farm.
Absolutely.
If I can just pick up the point, you mentioned Storm Debbie there as a good example. That was a period, if you take the 24 hours when that was happening, those were huge wind speeds, and we saw them here in the island. For that 24-hour period, the Walney Extension offshore wind farm, that's the nearest to the island in the Irish Sea, for that 24-hour period, it was producing in the region of probably 18 or 20 times the demand in the Isle of Man at that point in time. Now, that's just one of those wind farms in the Irish Sea, and it's quite close. And that's exactly why we're right about capturing the storage element, because if you can start to capture the storage element, then through offshore wind deployment, you can actually manage to get to a really reliable source of long-term duration power if you can crack that nugget. So, that's something that is being identified by countries all around the world. When they're talking about doing offshore wind as the backbone to their electricity grid, it's about being that base load, even when it's low wind speeds, if it's still at the right capacity of deployed offshore wind, then you can get to that regular 20-30% at any given time is your supply, and then you can have those alternatives at low wind speed. And when it's at full pelt, you can have way over and start to store that and secure it for future use.
But there's an irony there, isn't there, Dave? Because climate change is making the weather and, climate systems more violent, and yet it's the violence of Storm Debbie that's going to give you lots of juicy electricity.
Yeah, I've been recently out in the Faroes, and it's amazing how they cope with hurricane, and then it stops. And batteries kick in to bring the power back, in milliseconds. It's incredible. But I think back to the local businesses, what you can offer residents and local businesses is cheaper electricity, and also it's predictable. Who knows what the price of gas is going to be tomorrow, never mind in 5 years. So it's predictability, but it's also affordable.
Sure. Okay, let's get some more questions. Gentleman over there.
After just hearing what I've heard there, and I went to an MUA meeting where they said they wouldn't consider additional batteries for storage, and also been to Ofsted's presentations elsewhere. The new wind farm they're talking about can present many more times the island's capacity of energy use, and yet the MUA is still talking about developing its own wind farm. The Ofsted field would feed directly into Douglas. The infrastructure is already there from the power station. Why the hell are we actually talking about spending millions on a wind farm when there's one going to be built?
Well, we know why you need to do it. We've got the legal commitments, we've got the science commitments. Orsted Wind Farm, Mr. Galloway will have a better indication about when that will go live. And I think there's talking about a spur to the Isle of Man of 100 megawatt. I think, again, Mr. Galloway will know more about that than I. But we can't wait for that. Action needs to take place now. We should be putting up the solar panels now. I mean, the wind turbines have to go through the planning process. It's a legal process. There's environmental impact assessments. I can understand that. But there's solar panels you can put up immediately. We should be, and even you don't need planning applications for certain scenarios. So we could be doing that now. In terms of the battery, I was absolutely aghast when I saw that Manx Utilities weren't going to deal with the battery. They say the turbines are going to be generating so quickly. I think a capacity factor maybe of 60%, which is incredible for onshore, maybe 65%. Erie Staying, it's very windy. So that's amazing, but we shouldn't just be limiting ourselves to that. We should be thinking bigger, and a battery is the solution. Battery prices dropped 80% in the last decade. They're going to drop further. They're even down from $1,300 per kilowatt hour to 130 over the last decade. That's amazing.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that, what you just said about batteries, but the fact is that the MUA is already millions of pounds in debt already, and yet we're talking about spending more millions of pounds in providing a wind farm on island, and we haven't even gone through the NIMBYs that can stop it because of the bloody planning consents. The government will not force it through. So you'll get delays and delays and delays. By that time, Orsted's farm will be up and running.
Well, the wind turbines will save us money. We know gas prices have been the cause of this inflation. It's supply side. It's because war in Ukraine. It triggered everything in Europe. So we know what's the problem. We need to put in renewables to save people money.
Dave?
I would just
say, agree with you. Yeah.
You're absolutely right. I mean, you can do a private sector and public sector collaborating, but you do need to welcome the investment from the private sector as well. It shouldn't all be done by the public sector because it's a big upfront investment. Sure enough, it will pay off over 25 years, but there's a huge amount of investment at the start, and the private sector industry are very good at what they do, the energy industry, so you need to use both. I say the infrastructure part to make sure you can get power on the grid is the key one, that you can distribute it to people, that they would be allowed to put solar panels up if they want to do it as a private individual, or if a company wants to invest in a solar park, that's welcomed rather than seen as a threat.
All right. Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. Amy.
I just wanted to have a question open to the panel. What you think the effect of the energy to waste plant is on the total energy plan of the island, and how useful you think that is in terms of energy?
Okay, Dave.
Well, we've done the modelling. It does have a useful. It does provide electricity, but you could use the heat as well, and that's probably what we would say. You'd use that for district heating. There's obviously housing estates nearby, so that would make sense to use that. Now, if rather than perhaps building a combined heat and power station for biomass, which there's really not enough biomass, you could use a waste agricultural material in the energy from waste as well. But it's only going to be a small part, probably somewhere between 5 and 10% is probably the maximum you could get in terms of electricity use now. So it's a small part.
Sure. Adam, briefly.
Yeah, I mean, just following on from what Dave said there, I mean, at the moment, the energy from waste plant contributes a relatively small proportion of our electricity on the Isle of Man. The government's wider sort of environmental targets, I believe, are aiming to reduce the amount of waste we produce, which would probably reduce the production that you then have in the energy from waste plant as well. And ultimately, wouldn't it be great if we were sending nothing to the energy from waste plant, right? That's probably a little bit optimistic, but you'd like to think that's going to trend down. So ultimately, the energy from waste plant is there, it's producing electricity, it's contributing, and that's great. But equally, it's got a lifespan. Like any electricity infrastructure that's on the island, there's going to come a point where it becomes obsolete. And over time, it's only going to become more obsolete as we achieve some of those wider environmental goals outside of just the energy transition. But in the short term, it's a great source of, I'm stealing facts from Dave's report, to be fair, but sort of near renewable, I think, is the phrase that you use. You know, it's better than burning fossil fuels, right? But ideally, we wouldn't be burning anything. We'd be using completely renewable electricity.
Sure. Lawrie, final word.
And I think that comment there about the direction of travel in terms of waste is really valuable, because the reality is we want people to throw less stuff away. We don't want to be burning waste as much as we can get away with it. And so at some point, it will tip. I remember when I was on the Ramsey Commissioners, we had a conversation about recycling versus burning, and it was cheaper to burn the waste in the incinerator. But at some point, that will switch, and it will be cheaper to recycle than to burn it. And the moment that happens, you'll suddenly see everyone on the island stop burning stuff and start recycling. And the reality then is, well, what do we do? Because there will still be a need for some type of waste disposal like that on the Isle of Man, but it will be quite expensive. But I think the primary purpose of the energy from waste is more about waste disposal rather than anything else. I think the energy generation is a nice to have. It's an add-on. It's more about waste disposal, and it's a slightly more complex question, I think, than simply, does it generate useful electricity? It does, but it serves a broader purpose.
Indeed. All right, we're going to draw the conversation to a close there. To our panel, ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause. Thank you all very much indeed. And my thanks go to all of you for your questions. Really insightful discussion we had. It's been a fascinating evening. I think we've established a few things, that even as individuals, we can all make a difference, recycling, promoting a more circular economy, and so on. Times are tough economically. We all know that. There is a cost of living crisis. But ultimately, it is actually, in the long run, cheaper to go green. And the pressure has to be maintained because we know what the science says. The pressure has to be maintained to reduce reliance on fossil fuels. The Isle of Man is the sick man of a lot of islands in this regard. There is no question about that. The evidence is there. It's lagging behind other small island nations. But it can move up the sustainability league table. It has the resources. We've got amazing wind. Amazing wind, clearly. But there has to be the political will, and there has to be the drive to push that forward. I've also heard, apparently, that there is an Uber of the Isle of Man, described by my learned friend from the Green Party here, and that can only be a good thing. Well, what a fascinating discussion it has been. A big thank you to all our panellists this evening and our fantastic studio audience. And to you, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.